Welcome to Surviving Society.
Welcome to this special episode of Surviving Society, guest presented by me, Hannah Yelin from Oxford Brookes, and my co-author and co-presenter today, Laura Clancy from Lancaster University. This episode focuses on our research project, Cultures of Digital Hate, and what happens when researchers experience backlash when sharing their research publicly. Laura, will you kick us off by outlining our own experiences that started us down this line of research?
Yeah, so Hannah and I first started working together in 2018, and we wrote a journal article for the journal Celebrity Studies that was about Meghan Markle. So if you remember, around this time, Meghan Markle had just married into the royal family, so she just married Prince Harry. And there was a lot of talk around the time of the wedding about her kind of modernising the institution and modernising the monarchy. And Hannah and I came together to write a piece that talked about this kind of narrative as the monarchy co-opting Meghan Markle's feminist identity and mixed race identity as a way of making the institution appear more progressive while making very little kind of institutional change. So this was published, I think it was December, Hannah, something like that. It was late in the year. And we randomly got this email on a Saturday evening from someone at the Sunday Times saying that they'd found our journal article, essentially, and we're going to publish a piece on it in the Sunday Times newspaper the next morning. So they did. That then got picked up by hundreds of news outlets around the world, really.
And what was the headline, Laura?
The headline was, "Academics accuse Meghan Markle of dropping feminism like a hot potato."
Which is not what we said, was it?
No, it's not what we said at all. And what we noticed as well was when other news outlets published a piece about it, they put hot potatoes in quote marks as though that had come from us, whereas actually it had come from the Sunday Times. So we could kind of see this getting really out of hand.
And one thing I always say when we talk about this experience is, well, academic listeners will know, drop it like a hot potato isn't really a phrase that would get through peer review. It's not. Aside from it not being what we think, it's just a really...
we also just didn't say that.
Yeah.
That wasn't what it wasn't. And it wasn't even anti-Meghan Markle, really, even though that's how it was portrayed. It was anti-monarchy, but not anti-Meghan Markle. So our experience of this really was it got out of hand very quickly. It was a weekend, obviously. I said it was a Saturday. It was really late on Saturday, it was like 9 p.m. or something ridiculous. So there was no one we could contact at either of our universities or on Sunday. And by the time we could on Monday, things had just really got out of hand. There'd been stuff all around the world. Hannah had been invited on, we'd both been invited, but Hannah went on Sky News to talk about it, during which they also had hot potatoes in quote marks as the kind of tagline across the bottom of the screen, which didn't
not that I could see that. So
no,
couldn't see that, so I couldn't ask them to correct that.
No, yes. I was watching in horror, but there was not a lot I could do from Lancaster.
I mean, we face each other constantly, but I was not actually at that moment on WhatsApp. Sky put this out on Twitter, didn't they? A little clip of it. And that clip got remediated, retweeted, shared around all other kinds of news outlets. And what was the reaction?
So, we were just getting absolutely bombarded. I mean, hundreds of notifications every minute. It was really overwhelming. And we're laughing about this, but like at the time it was actually quite dramatic.
Yeah, no,
of just abuse, just sexist abuse all
really,
Sunday.
Like, activates your flight and fight, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was horrendous, quite scary. We actually didn't get many kind of threats, as in physical threats, but it's still really terrifying to have that on you and have it coming in so quickly. And yeah, there was just no way to get a handle on it, and we didn't really know what we were doing. I think it's fair to say, like now, I think we would react very differently if that happened to us. But when you're in the moment, it's kind of hard to know how to respond to that.
One of the funny things was that we'd been writing about the silencing of Markle's activist voice. That's one of the things that we wanted to kind of critically draw attention to. And then the responses to us were like carrying this on. They carried on this tradition, telling us to shut up. So we've got some of the quotes here. We pulled them up to remind ourselves. And this is some of the really flattering response to me being on TV. Quote, couldn't stand 5 minutes of her irritating voice. Another said, "Shut up, you mad mare," or "This woman sounds like a bellend," or tweets in response. And this, we thought about this, and this contradiction between us talking about the silencing of Meghan Markle and then that happening to us as a response. And Mary Beard has written this very good, very small, very accessible book called Women in Power. And she argues that society has a culturally awkward relationship between the voice of women and the public sphere of speech making, debate, and comment. And Mary Beard beautifully charts very quickly and easy to kind of follow and understand 3,000 years, which is basically men telling women to shut up. That's what we were observing and commenting on, and then that was what we were experiencing. So
from this, it took us a few months to think about this and let it settle a bit. But then we thought there was something in it. So we wrote a journal article, an autoethnography of this experience, where we looked at the comments. We could see that there were patterns when we were reading them as we went along, and we wanted to pick some of that out. So we have an article called "Doing Impact Work While Female, Hate Tweets, Hot Potatoes, and Having Enough of Experts." And we analysed the below the line comments, so on the Daily Mail, for example, and replies on social media, and found that the abuse we were receiving was very gendered. So that gendered language that Hannah just mentioned about, telling women to shut up, also things like bitches, things you would imagine coming through in there. And there was some really interesting connections as well to like ideas of fake news and Brexit. Obviously, we're talking at a time when everything was about Brexit in 2018, 2019. So one comment was, "Why does Sky constantly give a voice to people like this? It seems like it's an organisation obsessed with female issues, Brexit, female issues, Brexit, female issues. You might want to report on some actual unbiased news for once. How about some news that actually includes men?" Yeah. So there were these really interesting patterns that you can read the article if you want to know a bit more about, where we pick out some of these kind of patterns between what was happening more broadly in public discourse and then what was happening to us on this very, very specific issue of Meghan Markle and the monarchy and feminism.
Another one is another pattern that we observed was abuse about our disciplinary areas. So there's a fairly long-standing slur about the idea of media studies being a Mickey Mouse subject, and some of the commenters were saying things like, one lectures in sociology and the other researches celebrity and gender issues. Are we really expected to take these people seriously? And there were lots of comments along these lines, kind of denigrating social sciences kinds of subjects. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these subjects are ones that question the status quo.
Yeah, and I suppose that links to like other populist sentiments around. There was a lot of kind of anti-expert sentiment, which again was a condition of a symptom of Brexit, I think. So calling us fake news, saying that we were typical far left extremist academics. There was a lot of talk about kind of academia brainwashing student with leftist views, which you can see patterns to, wider talk around right-wing things like Jordan Peterson, for example, who uses that kind of language.
And this is the time around when Gove had said the nation had had enough of experts. So it's definitely was part of a wider anti-expert sentiment going on at the time.
And then finally, there was some these were maybe the funnier ones, and we laughed at the time, questions about whether we were being paid by Meghan Markle to insult the royal family. Unfortunately, we weren't. That's kind of questioning our legitimacy, I suppose.
And all tied up with that milieu of fake news and a lack of trust.
Yeah, exactly. So we did this. We had that experience. We both talked about it quite widely. I was writing a book about the monarchy at the time, and I actually found that quite difficult to return to, because every time I kind of tried to write the chapter in my book, Running the Family Firm, that I have about Meghan, all I could hear was this kind of abuse. It really threw me for quite a long time. I kind of started speaking to this with other people, and so did Hannah, and we realised that this is obviously a much bigger problem than just me and Hannah, and lots of people were experiencing this. and that we heard lots of stories of really terrible ramifications for the individuals involved in this and for wider society. And we also recognised that, of course, as two cisgendered white women, there were clearly other experiences of online abuse that were happening that we weren't receiving, that other people, other academics with other types of identity would be receiving. So from that, we set up our project, Cultures of Digital Hate. And this is kind of where we're coming from doing this podcast for you today, to share our findings from that project that we've done with academics and other members of staff that we'll talk about in a minute, and their kind of experiences and our overall findings and our thoughts about where we are in academia with all of this at the minute. When we experienced this and when we wrote that first article, academic Twitter was a really big thing. It's not now. And I think that has changed things a little bit, actually. And there's also other things that have come in since then that are more prevalent now that we can talk a little bit about. So today we're going to have a conversation about what it means to be visible in online cultures that we already know are beset by racism, sexism, xenophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, and so on. The labour politics of this kind of growing expectation that people will have a public profile as part of their job. And of course, it doesn't just affect academics, but people with all kinds of roles. So journalists, for example, politicians, there are lots of patterns between what Hannah and I have found in our research and what people have found when they're researching those groups of people as well. So it's a question around visibility and the risks of visibility and what that might mean for wider society, given the context we're in of rising populism and misinformation and the culture wars.
So then what we did was we set out to find out the experiences of other academics from different backgrounds to us. And we sent around a survey and we got 85 responses from academics from all different disciplines across the UK. And then from those, we did a further 13 in-depth interviews. Also did a series of public discussions with 17 speakers from law, tech, data, activism, charities, think tanks, academic impact workers, and academics from across all different disciplines. And then we did a second stage of research because we realized that this is not just something that's implicated with the academics who are in the public eye, but there's also a whole set of different types of university and professional services staff who are involved in this as well. So we then circulated another survey, this time to anyone who was involved in supporting or encouraging academics into the public eye. So, we had senior management and professional services staff across UK universities in job roles that included press officers, all different kinds of levels, industrial liaison, social media officers, public engagement managers, impact officers, and all of those were at various levels of seniority. And then we had people like vice chancellors for research or research directors. And then from that survey, we got 59 responses. And again, we did another 13 interviews to get that depth.
So what we found was that the academics were telling us that this kind of public academia, sharing your research publicly, is often required by their institution. So it's something their institution really wanted them to do. And lots of them said their institution actively encouraged them to do that. And from funders as well when they were writing funding bids. And people felt that their careers might be damaged if they didn't participate in that. But 74% of the survey respondents said they'd experienced harms as a result of sharing their research online. So the overwhelming majority had experienced some sort of harm doing this thing that they were told was part of their job by their employers. And by people associated with that, like funders. And
that's 74% of the academic respondents responding to that first survey.
Yes, sorry, yeah, that was just academics. And from that same first survey and the first interviews with the academics, I mean, we were really quite, I don't think we were surprised by the data, but we were quite shocked by the severity of what we were hearing. Some of it is horrendous, where they were reporting things like abuse and threats, including rape and death threats, both to the academics themselves and to their wider families as well that were implicated in that. What people called stoked and coordinated pile-ons on social media like Twitter. So it wasn't just individuals, there was kind of these campaigns against them. Abusive emails and also abusive mail in the post. So people had gone out their way to find their address, which is obviously really scary, phone tapping, hacking, doxing, stalking, calls for them to resign that were sent to their university by people that asked for the academic to be made to leave, and targeted harassment around their workplaces and also around their homes. So people who had found their personal address and were doing poster campaigns or something against them to call for them to have to leave their job.
I mean, in some ways that put it in perspective for us that our experience was really unpleasant, but apart from some threats of doxing that didn't actually come to fruition, we didn't have anything as bad as some of our respondents shared with us. Part of what's really shocking is that academics are experiencing this abuse when they're being encouraged by their employers to share their research publicly and be put in this situation. And that's some of the harms that they're experiencing. But also what was really shocking is the effect of those. So our respondents told us that some of them had been hospitalized by these experiences. They'd experienced suicidal ideation, a whole range of mental health issues like anxiety and depression, and PTSD. They talked about having been traumatized and re-traumatized by this process, as well as mental health issues. There were physical health issues leading to long-term sick leave from their jobs, or actually having to leave their job, or even move house. They told us about breakdowns in their personal relationships, real kind of injuries to their self-confidence that stuck with them. And they're just existing with a fear for their personal safety. A number of them told us about how this didn't just impact them, but impacted their wider family or their children. It has this unbounded kind of way of seeping into all these aspects of their lives. As part of the survey, we asked the question, do you feel your institution effectively prepares staff for the risks and challenges of public academia? And 90% of them said no. We asked another question, which was, has your institution offered any staff training or support for doing media or public work? If so, does this cover how to deal with backlash? And 98% said no, and 2% said they don't have an institution. So that's actually 100% saying no. Just that 2% of them all pointed out that they're precariously employed or not employed, and they are independent academics. So they are, shining a light. That little bit of data is there, shining a light on the fact that even the horrific experiences and horrific experiences of being unsupported that we're receiving from our participants, they're the privileged ones that have an institution. And there's a whole nother issue there about people having to do this work in the hope that it'll translate into jobs or funding bids to do this work in more supported environments.
So what we found in the surveys and interviews with both the academics and the research engagement facilitators, so there's kind of different staff within the university that Hannah outlined earlier, they both demonstrated that there's kind of an acknowledgement of the severity of the issue amongst the vast majority of those people that we surveyed. And they all had variously horrendous stories to tell us about different things that had happened at their institution. And there was also a lot of them, felt there was a lack of clarity around who is responsible for these issues. So many of the research engagement facilitators were saying that, they were doing some of this support work for academics who'd been through these really awful experiences. They were kind of doing that support work off their own backs. It wasn't in their job description. It wasn't what they signed up for. There wasn't any training available for how to do that or any support for dealing with some pretty traumatic stories and experiences that might just land on their desk on a Monday morning. But they ended up doing it because as the person who, talks to staff about engagement, academic staff felt comfortable going to them. Basically, they felt like they had those relationships to do that work, but they themselves felt wholly unprepared to do that. And it's not necessarily what they signed up for. And both the academics and the research engagement facilitators said that the organisational structures within universities around public engagement work were often very opaque. So a lot of them were telling us that, if I come across this and this is an issue that escalates and we need to get more people involved, I don't necessarily know who I should go to if these issues arise, because there's no kind of obviously outlined flowchart or whatever that might be for people to follow to know how to escalate that and know where to go. And what academics were telling us about this is that meant they were often having to repeat these quite traumatic experiences over and over again to various people within the institution in order to get the help that they needed, because there was no process in place to help them, help that be escalated by somebody else. So one person said, they've been re-traumatized again and again by having to keep recounting the same information and sharing the same, abusive messages that they were getting and recounting their story. So I think what this points to, and what Hannah and I observed, is kind of a general lack of organisational thought around employee wellbeing. And we'll say a bit more about that later, but the ways in which this kind of public work that is kind of in the university, but also kind of isn't because it happens outside of it, and it's kind of on the individual because we're encouraged to make our own profiles and build our own kind of public profile, but is also as part of our job. This sits really weirdly, I think, within organisational structures, and we think that's part of the reason why it's fallen through the cracks, and then it's not considered work. But we really observed this kind of lack of organisational structure and how that affected all different people involved in this work at all the different levels. So
our first publication that we have produced from this data, if you want to find out more about it, it's in New Formations Journal. And it's called, I have a folder in my email called Hate Mail. That's a real verbatim quote from one of our respondents. Academic public engagement, digital hate, and the unequally distributed risks of visibility. So you can look that up if you want to find out in more detail, but we'll tell you about some of the key findings. Obviously, the first key finding is that academics are seriously suffering, and I don't think that that's something that is accounted for in the uncritically positive discussions of impact and public engagement and knowledge exchange that we're always having. And, it's not that we're dinosaurs and want to kind of retreat to the ivory tower. That's how you get characterized if you're not too keen on doing this kind of public academia. But, one of our goals has been to bring in a little criticality and awareness that these risks also are not distributed equally. Because we found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, academics from marginalised backgrounds are particularly targeted and disproportionately affected. So one of our respondents called that the double whammy of gender and race, highlighting that this kind of digital hate is functioning intersectionally. And when we reflected on this, we were reminded of a brilliant piece of work by Elizabeth Gross called Volatile Bodies Towards a Corporeal Femininity. And she talks about the mind-body dichotomy. And we have this idea of, academia as a place of the life of the mind. It's a kind of disembodiment, this idea of the intellectual, and that disembodiment is really reserved only for those who have the privilege to be not marked by their body, that is namely white, cisgendered, heterosexual men, right? So they can transcend their body to be associated with mind. And we had this piece of data. We asked the question whether online abuse ever focused upon personal characteristics, and one respondent answered, I'm a plus-sized female immigrant who talks about vaccine-related topics. What do you think? Which I think, really kind of calls to mind Gross's work that shows how certain bodies are always marked and not considered to be the right body for academia, and this kind of disembodied state of being the intellectual.
And we also found this, the type of body that is accepted, in quote mark, within academia, kind of traced along different identities. So we found a lot of racist and xenophobic abuse, as though people being told to go back to their country. And somebody said they're being told that just because that person does not look white. So it was based on your little kind of profile picture on Twitter or whatever it might be, that then led to that kind of racist abuse. Another person who, a respondent who was researching white supremacy, and they were researching the topic in a country that they did not live in. They were researching about another topic, and they were getting these accusations that they should stay out of other countries' business. So that idea of kind of policing borders and policing boundaries and who is kind of permitted to speak, what that categorization is based on, it's based on different types of bodies and who's allowed to belong. And that made us think about Sarah Ahmed's work on Being Included, where she kind of reflects on that silencing effect of being a person of colour in a predominantly white institution. As we know, universities in the UK still are. The amount of people of colour, in particularly among professors, for example, is still depressingly low, and how we can see that reflected in some of this abuse. And it's worth pointing out as well that this kind of personalised abuse based upon, particular what they visibly saw about people's bodies, it wasn't necessarily linked to the research. So people, for example, who were doing research on the environment and the environmental crisis were getting racist abuse. So it wasn't like there was a connection between the kind of the research itself and what someone was reading about it and the person. It was that people online were looking for a picture of that person and then targeting them their identity.
It's like they're both separately risk factors, both the identities and the topics can bring heaps of risk and abuse on people. Another theme that we observed was gender functioning in different ways. Quite interestingly, on the one hand, we've already talked about the female academics receiving gendered abuse. So, for example, one of our respondents talked about threatening violence, but along the lines of witch burning or burning her at the stake. So really, really gendered language. Another observed that nearly all of the hate that they received was from men and not from women. So there's this kind of gendered hate that really fits in with, we've talked about Mary Beard, but there's also that brilliant book by Gilly Boyce Kay, Gender, Media and Voice, where she points out that we've got a long history of punishment and humiliation for women who dare to speak out. And she traces this starting with the ducking stool, which was a form of punishment for women who were deemed to be gossips, where they were strapped in and submerged in water. So there's this kind of attack on women that's kind of very much in that history. One of the female respondents told that she was told to get back into the kitchen, that classic way of telling women that they don't belong in the public sphere, they belong in the private sphere. But then, in contrast to that, we had a trans respondent say that they were told that they should have their children taken away from them, which is a terrifying, horrible thing to be told. But really kind of interesting to sit next to, for the women, you shouldn't be speaking publicly, you should be in the public sphere. For the trans people, we're going to come and intervene in your private sphere because this is the porosity that arises in this kind of unbounded nature of digital culture that doesn't actually allow us to maintain that solely professional safety, I suppose. Along with that kind of doxing mentality, enables strangers to make threats about that might affect your home life.
And then academics who were had a disability were talking to us around how they kind of don't have these informal systems of support that might give them support that the institution was not. So one said that they've got a lot of health issues and those had to take priority. And their quote was, "I simply cannot afford to let all this get into such a shitstorm that I can't control it." In a way, they're talking about a privilege of kind of being able to kind of go through that, whereas they had these other things that were much more pressing they needed to take care of. And I mean, that reflects more generally things like ableism across universities that are increasing, particularly more recently when we're seeing the erosion of things like EDI, for example, that will be affecting all of that, I'm sure. And we also found working class academics were saying kind of similar things, actually, around the ability to access systems of support. So some people were saying, I didn't get any support from my institution, but I got support from other networks of academics that I'm friends with or who I know from conferences. And then there were these other group of people who were saying, well, actually, that it's a privilege to have those things and I don't have them and I need to rely upon my employer to do these things for me. So people who were saying that if they don't have job security, so there isn't that kind of network of people who can come to their support. There was also people who said they were being targeted about their class. So we had two comments around someone who had a northern accent who had comments about that, complaining about their accent, and then receiving abuse for being too northern. I don't think there's any such thing as being too northern, but how that was one of the things they were being targeted for. So again, another kind of aspect of people's visibility coming into play. And there's loads of great research about academia and class and working class academics. And Bell Hooks wrote of her own university experience about how some individuals from class backgrounds can be deemed undesirable and are kind of encouraged to betray their class origins in order to fit in. And I think that reflected some of those comments around those accents in particular, which become very visible. I'm thinking about my own accent now as I'm saying this. It makes you really self-aware. Radio, for example, or TV, where your accent becomes, very hyper-visible, and how that can make, people from different places reflect on that.
In our next publication is reflecting on the labour politics of this, thinking about it in relation to questions of workplace safety, and how this stuff is resourced and managed and enabled, and to really think about the culture that produces these circumstances that these are academics' experiences. That's the first article where we're bringing in this data from what we're calling, can't tell you where it will be yet, is called Universities Don't Value This Sort of Work at All. Again, that's a verbatim quote. Public Academia, Digital Hate, and the Labour Politics of Health and Safety. So we're drawing on the work of brilliant scholars before us, like Thomas Almer, who in an article called Academic Labour, Digital Media and Capitalism pointed out that the fact that we frequently characterize, or in Almer's terms, misidentify universities as intellectual spaces and communities of scholars instead of considering them as workplaces means that we are impeded in critiquing the labour practices or considering issues like we're bringing in here, like health and safety. Part of the issue here is not only is the university not seen as a workplace, because we're all so passionate that it's not considered work, but also when it comes to this kind of public academia as a part of the work that we do, to repeat that quote that's in the title of our next article, universities don't value this sort of work at all. And these two things together mean that that work is not being considered work. So it's not being considered an issue of work-based health and safety. And it's worth just pointing out that the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 states that employers have a responsibility to provide employees with a, quote, safe system of work, a, quote, safe place of work, and that they must inform workers, quote, fully about all potential hazards associated with any work process. And we can just think back to that data that we had where on one question 90% and on the other question 100% said that they had not been prepared for these kinds of hazards, these potential hazards, to use the phrasing that's actually in the law, associated with their work.
And it made us reflect on what universities are today. And there's loads of really good research on kind of the neoliberal university, patterns between academic work and things like influencer cultures, for example, where we're kind of all meant to be doing this kind of self-branding exercise that, as lots of our participants said, is that it's a hell of a lot of work to set yourself up in that vein. The work of Ross Gill has written a few really nice pieces around the setup of universities and how this kind of public academia sits in a really weird place in the middle of all of this. So on the one hand, it's kind of not considered serious work and it's not valued. But on the other hand, you're being constantly encouraged to do it as part of this kind of neoliberal model of what the university is. And public engagement is sitting somewhere in the middle. And part of our argument is, this is why it's kind of fallen through the cracks, and that it doesn't neatly sit really in this kind of very old-fashioned, tweed jacket, elbow pad version of the university that still exists in some places, versus this new model of the university as a business. And public engagement sits really weirdly in the middle of that. Lots of our participants noted that it's not accounted for own workload models. It's something you have to kind of do additionally in your own time. And to get good at it, it takes a lot of time. People said it's a skill. It's a skill to, learn, if you do media work, to kind of learn how to speak to the media. A lot of the time, journalists will contact you very last minute with a few hours notice, wanting you to kind of jump in with a comment or go on live TV, or you'll get a call at 9 p.m. for a radio show at 6 a.m. the next day. It doesn't necessarily follow the patterns of normal working hours, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And it's quite difficult to fit, if you've got a full teaching load, that's quite difficult to kind of fit in alongside that. And all the work that goes into having a social media profile, having a website, talking to the journalists. They'll often want a pre-chat, and sometimes that pre-chat will lead to the real thing. Sometimes it'll lead to nothing. Sometimes they'll want you to travel across the country to go and do some kind of something. There's all of this work that kind of goes into it, and it's very rarely, we found, with our participants, accounted for in any kind of workload models. So people kind of aren't getting the hours for doing that work.
And it's worth saying here as well that that's not just the academics complaining that it's not. So it's not valued in terms of resource. It's not valued materially by giving the academics time, but also the research engagement facilitators that we spoke to were also kind of pointing out how they're really not resourced well to support it. It's very inadequate, the time that they're given on that side as well.
And often those teams of public engagement facilitators are the first ones to be cut. And as we know, with what's going on in the universities at the moment, where there's so many redundancy programs going through, those are the teams that people said are affected anyway by these kinds of changes within institutions.
Yeah. So it's not valued in material resource terms, and it's also not valued in kind of the status or prestige terms either. Yeah.
So there were questions around questions about, is it a high status output? So one person said, to be honest, it would be easier not to do this kind of work. I would have more time, and I would probably have got some of the jobs that I applied for because I would have had more time to do, and they called them high status outputs, quote. So what they're talking about there is kind of peer-reviewed journal articles or books, right? But of course, again, there's a really weird kind of contradiction there in a university, in that, this might be considered not a high status output, not peer-reviewed, not referable, whatever a university might want to say. But at the same time, we're being told to do it, and it's really important for the university and the university's reputation to get the university out there, and they often kind of keep track of how many times their name is being mentioned in the media, and by which news outlets and so on. And it's all important for the visibility of the institution, and they want us to do this as part of sharing our research beyond the academy. But then if it's not being valued in the same way as a journal article, how are we accounting for that? And what does that mean for people who are applying for promotion, for example, or applying for a new job?
So contradictorily, it is mandatory, but it's also marginalised.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that one of the themes that came through in our data in terms of how it was marginalised was feminisation. So one female academics colleague was told that they're the, quote, academic Beyonce because of their followers online as a consequence of their public facing work. And, maybe a throwaway observation like that is meant to be a compliment, but in that context, and it was certainly interpreted that way by the respondent, that it's suggesting a lower cultural register, right? It's that kind of drawing on a popular figure. It's suggesting a cultural register that is not deemed appropriate to academic work, right? Another female academic said, and we thought this was incredibly telling, quote, "I worry that I may be too promiscuous with my public engagement activities, and that this will mean I am taken less seriously." And so we thought, this is not only gendered but sexualized language, and this kind of mischaracterization of doing too much and trying too hard as being promiscuous really evokes these ideas of respectability in female visibility. And Bev Skeggs writes brilliantly on that. But this idea that it's promiscuous to do this, we really kind of felt like that spoke to a kind of slut-shaming, victim-blaming logic, where when you combine that with what we know from our data about the backlash and abuse that academics can receive, that victim blaming logic really feels like, well, you wanted the attention, you've brought this on yourself. And like the structure in a neoliberal university where it's, there is no support around you, really supports that idea that you do this yourself. And when the reputation is benefiting, great, but if it goes wrong, you're on your own.
We also found that, and this was a kind of a repeated theme, that universities were more interested in reputational management than taking care of their staff. So people who were telling us that, when these kind of bad things happen to us, the universities, and we're saying the university is this kind of mythical thing as well. And it's hard to kind of say what it is, but what they were saying the response to them was very much kind of how can we protect the institution in this situation, not how can we protect the individual researcher. And these were some of our kind of most horrendous stories that we heard about abuse. They were saying they felt their university was much more interested in themselves than in looking after them and in making sure they were okay. So one of the research engagement facilitators said, they were talking about their institution and they said, well, they don't want bad press. That's not a written thing. It's not even verbal. It's just a known thing that they will handle certain things with kid gloves. They want really nice, fluffy, good interest pieces. And we don't want bad things to be reflected on us as an institution because that reduces recruitment, etc. We are a business. So that idea that everything that gets put out in the public eye is about marketing, is about student recruitment, and is about all of these things that were kind of hammered into us that are the most important thing within universities at the expense of staff safety. And of course, that idea of kind of fluffy, good interest pieces, again, is like kind of feminized language around, fluffy pink things that we might see. And that's what universities are interested in. So there were some people who told us, the university was very careful around topics that they saw to be potentially difficult or challenging, and they weren't very interested in that. And that was sidelining some types of research, who felt like the kind of university was not supporting them with that because it didn't fit the brand that the university wanted to push. There were some people who, told us the university, they were experiencing all this horrendous abuse, and their university was kind of actively looking for ways to make that work for them, in impact case studies and things, for example. Again, at the expense of the employees' health and safety that was not being looked after.
Exactly. I mean, I think just before you move on, I think that quote is wild. They say, it's not a written thing. It's not even verbal. It's just known. We are a business. I mean, that's so making explicit the neoliberal logic that we're operating under and that's being required to be internalized, and for that to be part of a conversation that should be about employee well-being. That when the risk and the detriment, aside from reputational capital, is taking us back to those examples that our respondents gave us of, just the total demolition of their lives.
Yeah, and Anne Cronin, who's my lovely colleague at Lancaster, has written this piece about, she calls it reputational capital in the PR university. So how, universities are kind of increasingly traded on this. They just want a good image. And how do I look against this kind of narrow list of competitors that we all seem to hold, that we have to constantly hold ourselves up against. How can we make ourselves look best in this situation? How can we save this rather than taking care of employees?
Yeah.
And our argument is, until universities start valuing public engagement work, and until they see it as work and see it as a type of labour, which our argument is at the moment it's seen as kind of a hobby on the side, or it's something that you do extra, it's something that you do in the evenings or whatever that might be. Until the universities start taking that seriously as a type of work, then they can't be held accountable for the harms arising from it, because we can't hold them accountable through the Health and Safety Act, for example, because it's not seen as happening inside the institution, it's seen as happening outside of the institution. And there's kind of really complicated boundaries that are constantly being transgressed.
We've talked about the impact on individuals and the inequality at the heart of that. We've talked about the labour politics of visibility. And of course, that doesn't just affect academics, but anyone who's encouraged to have a public profile as part of their job. But we should probably finish by thinking as broadly as possible about the wider ramifications for society. Now, one of those key issue that we raise is that certain voices are kept out of public debate because the cost of participation is too high. And, you know, as we've pointed out, in those unequally distributed risks of visibility, that is targeting people who are already marginalised in racist, sexist, queerphobic, transphobic, ableist, fatphobic, xenophobic societies. There's probably more that I have missed there. But yeah, so this is an EDI issue that is compounding existing inequalities and limiting the diversity of voices in public debate. You know, and we do not want a monoculture in that way. And yeah, another key kind of wider ramification is that we're existing in a context of rising misinformation. Academics sharing peer-reviewed research could be a corrective to that, right? They're sharing data that has been tested and proven and peer-reviewed and shown to be replicable. That, you know, these are credible, should be trusted voices, and they cannot be a corrective to misinformation if they're being kept out of the debate. And I think, of course, you know, this is not chance. This is a deliberate part of how this hate, how this abuse is mobilized, how it functions to, you know, and we think about which voices are kept out in identity terms and also in terms of which topics and which disciplines are subject to attack. Galpin and Vernon wrote a great article on post-truth politics as discursive violence. And they talk really well about how debates about what expertise is works to delegitimize academic expertise in ways that are particularly gendered or sexualized and racialized.
And since we've written all this, there's kind of, you know, there's a host of other things I think that have come in that are really interesting to reflect on. So on the 1st of August 2025, so not long before we're recording this, new laws came into force in the UK, which said that, quote, universities must actively promote academic freedom, ensuring campuses are places where robust discussion can take place without fear of censorship of students, staff or external speakers expressing lawful opinions. So that's around free speech. And of course, we know there are loads of debates around free speech and protests and things going on in the UK at the moment. And this is, to us, kind of a key part of this and how it affects particular voices being able to contribute to public debate and being visible in public discourse. And given that we know from our research and from looking around us as well, that there are particular kinds of research that are targeted. So feminist research, particularly research on trans issues, research on the climate crisis, on the far right, on colonialism and colonial histories. You know, there are these kind of particular hot topics that are particularly targeted in the media, so like the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, for example, but also on places like Twitter or X that are, you know, repeatedly targeted, where the same people are kind of being silenced again and again. That is creating this kind of vacuum of conversation around these issues.
Exactly. And it's worth us saying that what we're dealing with here is not just individual, you know, with quote marks around it, trolls. It's not just anonymous individuals who are taking issue. It's not just in social media. There's also a kind of symbiotic relationship with certain types of journalism that targets these issues. So a number of our respondents have, and also we've been doing some training, which we'll tell you more about, but ECRs that we've been training as well, have told us about a series of hit pieces about big funders wasting taxpayer money. This is hit pieces in the press, in the news, written by journalists. And, you know, this again targets certain types of research that they deem to be pointless. And the kind of social outrage feeds this kind of journalism, in that kind of social media outrage, I should say, feeds this kind of journalism in the kind of clickbait model, but also other direction as well, as was our experience. The backlash to our research did not begin in social media. It started when the Sunday Times wrote about it, and that was then remediated, republished around the world, and then in the responses below the line or in the kind of social media channels of those news organizations. So it's a kind of feeding in both directions, but it's not just individuals on social media. Journalism itself is heavily implicated. We came up with a phrase for that: the risks of research remediation. Saying it out loud feels like a tongue twister, but we found that our research was being remediated in ways which furthered populist or racist or Brexity agendas that we don't agree with. So that's another further risk beyond the own researcher well-being, is then what your research gets aligned with or used for beyond your control.
And these boundaries are constantly shifting and changing. We should say that we completed these interviews and the survey before kind of the latest news about Palestine, for example. And we know anecdotally that is, researchers who are kind of involved in that, or researchers who identify as Palestinian or whatever that might be, themselves are being targeted through this kind of news stories, and there's various other things that have happened in the news since we did this research. So the kind of the boundaries of what's being targeted are shifting and changing as well. I think that is kind of a new challenge, I guess, for researchers coming into different spaces, and that what, when and what will become a hot topic, I think is constantly up for debate. We've said a lot here, and, there is a lot to be down about all of this. And I mean, there's a lot to be down about generally about the state of universities at the moment, but it is, it's worth saying, I think, that this isn't inevitable, and the university could be different. And there is ways that we can build care into university structures and organisational structures, and it could resource this work to support all the staff involved in this, wherever they might be coming from, properly. So it could kind of recognise these risks and protect the people doing it through putting these organisational structures in place. And we've started to think about what that might look like. You can have a look at our website, Cultures of Digital Hate, where we've started to think about, how we might put some of that into practice. And I'm sure there's lots of other suggestions that people might have that we'd love to hear.
And, Laura talked about care. One of the things that we found, I haven't actually pulled up the percentage data point for us today, but one of the things about care is that people reported that they weren't getting it from their universities, but they were getting it from informal spaces. That care is there, and it lives in the gaps. It's there in the back channels and the ways that we care for each other in these moments. It shouldn't be the only safety net, but it's there. And it's what is getting people through at the moment.
But that shouldn't be the only safety net. Institutions have a responsibility as well. Of course, this is made even more complicated. We've had people recently tell us that they actually wouldn't trust their university to handle some of this. So we had a conversation recently with some people who were doing research on trans issues, for example, and they said, well, I wouldn't want my institution anywhere near this because of the kind of the institutional politics around these issues at the moment. I think it would be made worse. And I think the political implications of that would be incredibly difficult. So actually institutional support isn't the answer for me, who were talking about themselves personally, because that could make these issues worse.
And I mean, I suppose another thing is that there is shame attached to experiencing this kind of backlash. And it's, in that neoliberal university structure, as we explained, people are experiencing it unsupported. And so if any of the listeners are recognizing their own experience, you're not the problem. You're just living in a structure that wasn't designed to protect you. Or if the listeners are actually someone a little bit more in a position of power within the university, whether that's formal or informal, worth saying, please take seriously the risk of digital hate, and when people come to you, take seriously the harms that they're experiencing, and kind of let's bring some criticality and awareness of the risks and their unequal distribution to the conversations that we're having about impact and engagement and knowledge exchange, because visibility without safety isn't impact, it's just risk, and it's not being shared equally.
Yeah, and the ability to care for others and refuse to do these things are, strategies and ways to survive these kinds of structures. And it's okay to prioritise caring and protecting for yourself and, for your family or whatever whoever might be implicated in some of these issues. And you don't owe your trauma to things like the ref. You don't owe your trauma to be quantified as part of these university metrics. And you don't have to be visible if it's making you ill or affecting your life negatively. I think there's a lot of pressure on us to kind of maintain those profiles, and I think we need to step away from some of that when it's it's affecting so many people so badly.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned very briefly that we've been delivering training on this for AHRC DTPs, that's doctoral training partnerships, so for doctoral students. But for anyone listening that has any other ideas or would like to collaborate with us on other ways to combat these issues that we've raised today, or if you've got examples of good practice, you can get in touch with us. We are always thrilled to collaborate and hear from more people who are interested in improving these cultures within which digital hate is thriving.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Surviving Society Productions. To support our work, like, review and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky and Patreon.